Well, good morning. It's good to see you all out on this rainy morning. I don't know about you, but I, for one, am happy for the rain. I planted some corn a little bit ago, and that soil was real dry, and it really needs this rain. So, all right. Well, ever since we got here to Manhattan last summer, I think, Kevin has been running a class upstairs for anybody who's interested on sharing the gospel. And we have talked about giving sermons. We've talked about one-on-one interactions, small groups, and other things. And one thing that I've appreciated about this class, and Kevin, he's a smart guy, and he brings this up repeatedly because those are the 3 R's of education, right? Repetition, repetition, repetition. Is that in order to communicate effectively with somebody, you need to have a relationship with them. There needs to be some common ground on which you can communicate, okay? And I think of this in terms of vocabulary. One, because I'm a nerd. Yes, I have purposefully read through parts of the dictionary. But also, 2, because I like to read a lot. And so one of the important things about reading a book, and here I'm not talking about fiction, but here I'm talking about nonfiction, is you need to come to terms with the author. You need to figure out what are the important words that the author's using, and what do they mean by using those words. So if you flip open one of my textbooks that I keep on the shelf in my office, they almost all have to do with genetics. And if you open that up, you're going to very quickly need to know what terms like allele, locus, linkage disequilibrium, mutation selection balance mean. If you don't know what those mean, you're not going to be able to understand what the authors of those books are talking about. And the same principle applies in personal communication, right? If Kevin and I are sitting down for coffee, and we're trying to communicate with each other, if we don't have a common vocabulary about some things, so say the Bible, for instance, we're just going to be talking past each other. And this is basically what happens at presidential debates, for instance. There's no real communication happening. It's just talking back and forth, okay? If you don't believe me, go watch a couple. Or save your time and don't. But in any case, what we need to do is we need to come to terms with people. And this is important when you're sharing the gospel, because when you are talking to somebody, and we could just take a random person off the street now, say in Manhattan, odds are that person is going to carry ideas and terms and concepts that have some grounding in Christianity, whether they realize it or not. And that's just a fact of life. If you live in the contemporary West for the last 2,000 years, our conceptual, philosophical landscape has been shaped by Christianity, okay? Now, we've spent about the last 150 years trying to deny that as vociferously as we can, but it turns out that doesn't work very well. And so we have very interesting things happening now over the last 15, 20 years where some people are beginning to wake up to the fact that you can't have Western civilization without Christianity, okay? And this should not be a controversial statement. It is in some circumstances, okay? But this is the truth. To the point where Richard Dawkins, you know Richard Dawkins? Yes, you've heard of him? Okay, vociferous atheist, last year said publicly in an interview he considers himself a cultural Christian. Okay, so a man who has written books entitled things like The God Delusion, and who has said things like religion has never done a positive thing in the history of humankind, now says, I consider myself a cultural Christian, because he's come to the realization that a lot of the values that he held dear, it turns out, have their grounding in Christianity. They have their grounding in the Bible. So one of the challenges, if we take, again, our random person off the street of Manhattan, is coming to terms with them. Because if you're coming from, we'll call it a biblical standpoint, you have a certain understanding of words like sin, forgiveness, baptism, sanctification, that they may or may not have. And so you need to establish this common vocabulary, a common pool of concepts. In our world, if there are terms that you need to come to terms with, with somebody, there are things like autonomy, freedom, love, tolerance. Go look up what those are, how those are defined in the dictionary. You'll be surprised at the way that they're used now versus on paper at least, or say 100 years ago what we used to think those meant. And this is a challenge when we're thinking about evangelism because we need to be aware that these differences exist and not be frustrated by them. We need to account for them, and we need to work with them. So as we've been going through Acts for the last couple weeks, looking at the conversion accounts in Acts, looking at some of the sermons, we've come now this week to Acts chapter 17, where notably Paul goes to Athens and he gives a sermon on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, depending on your translation, and he speaks to a largely pagan, skeptical audience. And this is, I think, probably the episode in Acts where Paul most readily illustrates what he tells the Corinthians his approach to evangelism is. He writes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says to them, summing it up, "I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you," or that I might share in its blessings with you. This is what Paul says. And this is a challenging thing because in order to become all things to all men, one, it doesn't mean that Paul is going out and he's carousing with the Gentiles. Okay, remember, one of the characteristics of Paul's letter, he does it in Romans 1, he does it in Galatians chapter 5, is to give a laundry list of sins, right? He does this in 1 Corinthians 6 as well, and he'll just run through all of these things that the Gentiles do, and he says, all of these are things you shouldn't be doing. Okay? So if Paul is trying to run the race well, not in vain, he's obviously not doing all of those things to become like all men. But what is he doing? He's thinking about how do the people I am talking to see the world? How do they think? What are their patterns of thought? What are their assumptions? And what do I need to say to them? How do I need to speak the truth of the gospel in such a way that they will be receptive to it, that they will understand what I'm saying? And that's what Paul does masterfully here in Acts chapter 17, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. Now, to set the stage for where Paul is at here, Paul is in Athens, Greece. Okay? This is the intellectual epicenter of the ancient world. Okay? Rome is the dominant political and economic power in the Mediterranean at this time, hands down, no questions asked. This is the Pax Romana, the era following Augustus. Rome is top dog. However, most of what Rome has in terms of intellectually comes from Athens. If you wanted to be famous as a Roman, what you did was you went to Greece, you learned their philosophy, and then you translated it back into Latin for your patrician peers. Okay, this is why Cicero is famous. He also did some speeches. He was a bit of a politician, but one of the main ways that he became famous before he thumbed his nose at Julius Caesar was doing just this, translating Greek philosophy into Latin for his peers in the Roman Senate to read. So Athens is the intellectual epicenter. This is the city of Plato, of Aristotle, Thucydides, Herodotus, people that we still study today and that are still well worth studying today. And we're going to talk about one of them, Socrates, a little bit more in a couple minutes. So this is where Paul is at, a place more far removed from Jerusalem you almost can't imagine. Okay? This is not a city where there is one God worshipped. This is a city where ancient commentators tell us there are so many gods worshipped that every street corner has its own idol placed on a pedestal. Okay? People still go and visit the ruins of the Parthenon in Athens, one of the largest temples built in the city. And this is the sort of milieu in which Paul finds himself. As Luke tells us, he's just waiting for somebody. Paul hasn't come specifically to preach in Athens. He's on his way to Corinth, and he happens to stop here and wait for his friends to rejoin him so they can all continue on. Okay? So Paul isn't looking for an argument. But Luke tells us something interesting right at the outset. This is verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy at Athens, his spirit, it says, was being provoked within him as he was beholding the city full of idols. So what is the impetus for what Paul's about to do? He sees that the city is given over to idols. What is an idol? An idol is anything you worship that isn't God. Okay? That's the basic definition. An idol is anything you worship that is not God. So what does he see? He sees them worshiping, yes, all these statues. Okay, but there are many other things going on in Athens too. There are marketplaces. There are courts of law. There are political assemblies making rules for the city. And there are also, as we're going to find out, schools of philosophers walking around, talking and arguing. All of these things are idols that Paul sees the Athenians worshiping. And they don't just have to be statues. They don't have to be tales of supernatural beings. They can be things like money and knowledge and social status. All of these things can be idols. So this is what Paul sees, and then Luke tells us this is what Paul does. Verses 17 and 18. So Paul was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. And some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange demons," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So a couple things Paul's doing here. He's preaching Jesus and the resurrection. He's also reasoning. But where is he doing this? And how is it that Luke paints the picture of Paul and what he's doing in the city of Athens? All right? So, take a couple steps back. Plato, from Athens, founder of one of the great philosophical schools, considered the founder of modern Western philosophy. Most of what Plato wrote concerns his teacher, Socrates. Socrates is so important that everybody who came before Socrates we lump into one bag and call the pre-Socratics. There's a bunch of them. They believed a whole lot of different things, but they all get the same label, pre-Socratics. Okay? No schools before Socrates. Now, what did Socrates do? Okay, Socrates' MO was pretty simple. He walked around the marketplace asking people questions. And he would just walk up to people and say, "Hey, what do you think about justice? What does it mean to be pious? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to know something?" Now, presumably, most people didn't have time for this. Okay, they're busy. I've got to go sell my grain. I've got to go buy a chicken for dinner. I've got to go do this or that, right? But if Plato can be believed, some people stopped to have a conversation. And so we get these wonderful dialogues. And they're very snappy reading. Despite the fact that they are philosophy, they are a lot of fun to read. If you don't believe me, you can easily find a free translation online. I encourage you to try one, okay? However, this is what Socrates would do. He'd go around and he'd ask questions. He was a gadfly. He was annoying. He was a 4-year-old. He's just walking around going, why, finding somebody that he can drag into an argument. And then he would just keep asking questions until eventually they would contradict themselves, and then the dialogue ends. And this is what he would do. What is Paul doing? Yes, he goes to the synagogues. This is part of what Paul does. He does this everywhere that he goes. But what else does he do? He goes to the marketplace. And what does Luke say he does? He talks to everybody who happens to be there. Okay? Furthermore, the particular way that Paul describes this, he's reasoning. He's dialoguing with people. So this can be translated in a number of different ways: reason, convince, persuade, argue. The idea is that Paul is engaging in dialogue. He's talking to people. He's asking them questions. And when they answer, he says, "Oh, really?" And he asks for more information. He says, "Oh, but I've heard it this way." Or, "Have you considered this?" Okay? This is exactly what Socrates did. So the idea here is Luke is presenting to us Paul as a Christian Socrates here in Athens. He's come to the city of the philosophers, and he's doing pretty much exactly what they would have expected of a philosopher. And that's, in fact, why he comes into contact with some actual philosophers later on, because they would have been in the marketplace doing this same thing. This is what they did, okay? So Paul's then accused of something here, and this is going to lead to his speech. He's being accused of being a proclaimer of strange, the word is demons, sometimes translated deities or gods, but really the idea here, this is daimon, and you have theos, which is God. Daimon, demon, is one step below God. So maybe Jesus is a demigod in Greek thought, but they're accusing him of preaching of somebody who is sub-God, not quite there. Paul's going to take issue with that in a little bit. But this is also, as it turns out, what Socrates is accused of, and one of the reasons why he's forced to commit suicide by his city, by his fellow citizens of Athens. This is part of the apology, one of the earliest Platonic dialogues that we have. Is he's accused of teaching people not to fear the gods and teaching them to question everything. This is what Paul's doing. He's preaching against their idols. So finally he gets confronted, as we said. He's confronted, Luke tells us specifically, and this is really interesting, he tells us specifically, Paul's confronted by the Epicureans and the Stoics. Okay? Of four great ancient schools of philosophy up to this point, these are the two that are ascendant at the moment. These are the two big ones. And so they are the two, the Epicureans and the Stoics, who come and they confront Paul and they say, man, what are you talking about? This is crazy. We have never heard anything like this. We would like to know more about it. Okay? But why does Paul have this opportunity? Why is it that these philosophers have heard what Paul has to say? Well, it's because he's out there. He hasn't cloistered himself in the synagogues. He hasn't found a group of Christians who already exist in Athens, and he's just meeting in their houses and going around the city from house to house talking to them. He is out. He's in the midst of the people that he needs to convert, interacting with them, not setting himself up somewhere or hiding away. That's our first lesson from Paul in Athens. You can't evangelize people you're not able to talk to. You have to be at least close enough to shout at them from 50 feet away. Preferably closer, so that, one, you don't strain your voice and they think you're angry at them, and two, so you can actually dialogue with them. Okay? So they take him to the Areopagus, which is kind of like the Athenian court, we can say. It's a place they're going to take you to examine you. There's a panel of judges. This is where they dispute. This is where they argue. And they take Paul up here. And they ask him, may we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming? And here's Paul's opportunity, right? Because he's talking to these people who are called philosophers, which means lovers of wisdom. They like knowing things. They want to know how to live well. They want to know true things about the universe and the way that it likes. At this time, philosophy encompasses basically everything that we would also call natural science at this point. Okay? All of that falls under the category of philosophy in the ancient world. And they say, we would like to know what you have to say. And so Paul's going to take an opportunity to teach these philosophers of wisdom that they should all be, if they truly love true wisdom, lovers of God, which is who this entire book is addressed to, Theophilus, lover of God. That's what Paul is going to go. This is what Paul is going to go for. Now, the important thing to learn here, and we're coming back to setting up, coming to terms with people, speaking their language, he's going to do all of this without quoting a single scripture. Okay? Now, you can find parallels, for instance, between what Paul is going to say to the Athenians and what Stephen said to the Sanhedrin 10 chapters before. Okay? But Paul is never going to quote a single scripture. He is never going to say, like the writer to the Hebrews does, but someone somewhere says, and then quote a psalm. He doesn't do that. In fact, what he ends up doing is he quotes at least one Greek poet from a hymn to Zeus, and possibly a second one, although people are divided about whether or not he actually does that. Since he appears to quote the same person in Titus, I'm going to go with he probably is actually quoting this person here, but we'll get there. Okay? He's not going to quote a single scripture. What does he do instead? So verses 21 through 23 are the setup. 21, Luke is giving us some information that we need to know about the context Paul's in. And then 22 and 23 is the introduction of Paul's sermon. him setting up what he's going to say. Okay, so Luke in verse 21 tells us that the Athenians and the strangers who visit there like to do nothing but spend their time in talking about new things. They're all about novelty. Okay, so they would have loved cable television, right? But not cable news, because that's very repetitive. But they would have loved, commercials and everything else, right? They want to know things that are new. And so Paul is going to take advantage of this. And he starts out by talking to them. And he says, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" We're going to stop there for a moment. What does Paul set up here? Two things in particular. One, go back, he says, "I observed and I examined." You might have perceived, depending on your translation. These are two basically the same words. The first one is a verb. The second one is a verb with a preposition that intensifies or signifies a repetition on it. So he's using the same word over again. And the idea here is, I looked at what you worship, I looked at your idols, and then I looked again, and I looked more closely. Okay? He's showing close attention to the things that the Athenians love. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul agrees with what the Athenians love. It doesn't mean that he is condoning their worship of these idols, because clearly he's not. His spirit is provoked within him because he's seen their idols, right? But he is closely, and I'm going to say non-judgmentally attentive, meaning he observes it as a thing that happens. He's not drawing a value judgment. He says, okay, this is what you do. This is what you worship. We're going to take that as a starting point. That's our factual basis we're going to work from. Okay? He has not yet told them, I don't agree with you. All he's said is, I have seen and thought about what it is that you worship. Okay? Close attention. Second, he compliments them. Okay? He says, I've seen that you are very religious, he says, in all respects. Okay? I have noted, he says, that there is something good here. You desire to worship. And you're aware of it. And you're trying, however misguided he might think it is, he's not saying that yet. He's saying, I see that you want to worship truly, and he takes as evidence of this the multiplicity of gods and the multiplicity of idols that they have. They are searching for the God or the gods to worship, what they ought to be doing. And so he compliments them on it. He says, you are looking for the transcendent, and that's a good thing. Okay? Patient, he's closely attentive, and he's complimentary. Now comes the kicker. Okay? He's seen this altar, and he says, it has this inscription, to an unknown God, or we could say to an unrecognized God. And now here is his transition into the main body of his speech. He says, what therefore you worship in ignorance, this God I proclaim to you. So now he's tailoring his message specifically to the thing that he knows his audience desires, which is to know things. This is the whole reason that they've come to him. You are speaking strange things, Paul. What is this? This is what they do. They spend their time, Luke tells us, speaking about new things. And so he says, hey, I have some news for you. I know something you don't, so let me inform you. What you worship in ignorance, this God I proclaim to you. So this is Paul's attitude toward the Athenians. And just to stress this, because I think this is a very important point and something that we get wrong a lot, Paul doesn't agree with them. He doesn't agree with them. His spirit was provoked. Remember that? First verse. Has he said any of that yet? No, he hasn't. He's going to get there, but he hasn't said any of it yet. Okay? Pro tip, if you're trying to persuade somebody of something, don't lead off with, you're wrong. Usually that sets them up to be defensive, right? Now, maybe there are some extreme situations where that might be appropriate if somebody's in mortal danger or something. But that's not how Paul is going about this. And that isn't how we have to go about evangelizing either. He's taken time to get to know the Athenians, and he's going to address them where they're at, not where he wants them to be. He's going to try and persuade them to be where he wants them to be. But he knows that they're not starting there. So now the main body of Paul's argument here comes in verses 24 through, 26. Okay? And here, Paul is going to demonstrate his knowledge of his audience. Okay? He's speaking to a Greek audience. He is speaking to a Greek audience that is partly Epicurean in orientation and partly Stoic. And in the space of 3 verses, I have counted at least 4 misconceptions about God and the universe that the Epicureans, the Stoics, and the Greeks held that Paul is going to address in as many verses. Okay? And he's not going to come right out and say it. What he's going to do is he's going to try to make statements that he thinks they will agree with, and then he's going to draw out the logical conclusions from those statements. All right? Now, we could spend 2 or 3 sermons going through and looking at how Paul does this. We're not going to do that. We're going to go through it very quickly. But I want you to see the diversity of things that Paul is talking about here and hopefully convince you of the depth of his knowledge of of the people he's addressing. Okay? So first verse 24. Pardon me. Paul says, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." Verse 25, the beginning, "Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything." All right, we have already addressed 4 different things here. Okay? So first, creation. God who created the world. One of the beginnings of Epicurean philosophy is that the universe was created by chance. Okay? The Epicureans are atomists, they are materialists, and they believed that basically you have a bunch of atoms colliding over time and just pow, universe. And not just our universe, but many universes, okay? So they think that this is all just chance. Paul says, no, God created it, okay? 1 down. The Stoics, on the other hand, didn't believe that the universe popped into being by chance, but they believed that it was eternal. It had always existed, okay? Paul has also knocked this one out. God who created, meaning it happened at some definite point in time. So the universe has a beginning. It is therefore not eternal. All right? 2 down. Third, the Stoics were also what we now term pantheists. So they believed that God was coterminous with the universe. God is the universe is God. Okay? But if God created the universe, then God cannot be the universe. Okay, you see how that works? If I create something, it is not the same thing as me. So now we're up to 3. And then the final one out of this verse and a half, Paul's working fast here, although this is probably not a complete record of what he said, is that the Greeks believed that the gods needed temples. They needed places of worship. The gods dwelt in different places. They appeared in different places, and then those places were sacred to them. They needed sacrifices, and they needed offerings. Paul also says, hey, God doesn't dwell in your temples. They can't contain him. This is where you can go back to Stephen in chapter 7. Stephen says a very similar thing. Paul also says, God doesn't need your sacrifices. He doesn't need the grain and the animals and the gold and the silver and all the other things, because he already has it all. He created it all. Moving on then, in the back half of verse 25 then, Paul says, why is this? Since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. Verse 26, and he made from one, you might have one man or one blood, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. Okay, here are 3 more now. Try these on for size. Corollary to the universe was created by random chance that the Epicureans believed, they also believed that the gods were fundamentally uninterested in human beings. Okay? In Epicurean philosophy, the gods are kind of hanging out in the spaces between the worlds, and they're just content hanging out there, not involving themselves in our affairs. Okay? Well, what does Paul say? God not only created the universe, he provides for us. He provides everything. And furthermore, he has also scoped out where the different peoples are going to live and the times that they're going to rule over those particular areas and what the seasons are and everything, right? So God has planned all of this out. Now, partly here, and this may be surprising, is in a few ways, he is telling the Stoics, hey, you're on the right track. Because the Stoics believed that the entire universe was rationally ordered by God. So this is God rationally ordering himself, but it's ordered for the best. It's ordered for human flourishing. And Paul's kind of telling them, in a sense, you're correct. God is not the universe. The universe is not God, but God is ordering the universe for mankind's benefit. Okay? Are the Stoics completely correct? No. Are they partly correct? Yes. And there's the common ground. This is what Paul can use to draw the Stoics in. They kind of agree with this. Okay, Paul, tell me, what next? The third thing that Paul talks about against here is more fundamental to Greek culture, and that is that the Greeks had a very us versus them mentality. You were either Greek or you were a barbarian. And barbarian came from them making fun of the way that they thought other people talked. Okay? You are either Greek or you are a barbarian, and they are two very different things. Okay? Famously or infamously, Aristotle says in the Politics that there are people who by nature are slaves. Okay? Imagine believing that of somebody. Okay? Now, we think he was wrong, and we have good reason to think he was wrong. But this is the fundamental attitude in Greek culture. If you're not Greek, you're a nobody. And Paul is saying, no, actually, God has made from one, man or blood, depending on your translation, all people. And all means all. So there are not Greeks and barbarians who are fundamentally different. They're just labels you put on different groups of people. But they're all still people. They're all still created by God. That takes us through verse 26. Paul has just taken down 7 or 8, depending on how you count them, misconceptions that his audience has about the world. And he's drawn all of this out of some fundamental assertion that God created the world. So what does he do with this now? Okay, now he links what he has said, he links God's purposes to the Athenians' desires. Because remember where we started this, okay? Paul addresses two things. One, their ignorance. They want to know new things, so this is what he's in the process of doing. The other, he's complimented them on their religiosity. He has complimented them on the fact that they are searching for the divine. So now he's going to circle back to this, and he's going to say, why is it that God does this? Okay? Particularly for the Epicureans, why is it that Paul thinks God takes such an interest in human beings? Okay? And this is what he says in verse 28. So that they should seek after God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. This is why God has set the universe up this way. This is why he provides for us. This is why he has ordered things, because he wants to be in relationship with you. Okay? Again, he's complimenting them. God wants you to worship him. He wants to know you. Therefore, your religiosity, your searching for the divine, this is a good thing. It is good that you are open to this. It is good that you are searching for this. And this God, furthermore, wants to be found because he makes himself available. He is not far, Paul says, from each one of us. Okay? But he is inviting them here into this account of a God who cares, a God who created, a God who orders. Okay? Not a God who is impersonal and is just the stuff of the universe, or a God who doesn't care. It's a very different kind of God. Then verse 28, for in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. Now he's quoting, this is where he quotes two possible Greek poets. The first is Epimenides of Crete, who predates Paul by several hundred years. The other is Aratus. He's quoting from a poem called The Phenomena, which is about meteorology and astronomy. It begins with a hymn to Zeus in which, this is the line, it says, of Zeus, for we are his offspring. All right, so he's taking this idea that we are the offspring of divinity, humans are descended from divinity somehow, and he is using it as evidence for what he's arguing for. Okay? Incidentally, Aratus came from Cilicia, which is where Tarsus is from. So he was Paul's countryman, separated by a couple hundred years. it's very logical that Paul would have been familiar with the work, with this work. Okay? So this is how Paul brings things together. And now he comes to his conclusion for this section in verse 29. He says then, being then, or since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. This is his conclusion. If you're following along with me, he tells his audience, if you agree with my premises and you're following with the logic, this is the conclusion we should draw, that God is not like stone or gold or silver, because all of these are created things, and you can't create yourself. Something that doesn't exist can't make itself exist. The idea is that they have to agree with this now, if they've followed along with him. This is his conclusion. He begins with, you are seeking after God, and this is a good thing. I'm going to tell you something about the true God. He makes a statement that he thinks they will agree with. He goes through and addresses their misconceptions about it, and then he draws his conclusion and says, your idols are vain. Not in so many words. He's trying to bring them along with him and get them to reach the same conclusion. So now that he's come to this conclusion, then the next question is, Paul, what do we do? And this is his call to action. This is what he wants them to do now in verses 30 and 31. And this is where now, not having said anything more than I'm going to tell you about an unknown God, okay, so Israel hasn't come up yet. There's been no Garden of Eden. He hasn't mentioned sin. The cross hasn't come up. Jesus hasn't come up. Okay, none of these things that we would go to have come up yet. Now he says, therefore, having overlooked the time of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. This is where Paul's going to get cut off. So we can imagine he's turning toward Jesus now. Jesus is now on stage, or he's waiting in the wings. Paul's never going to get there in Athens. Okay? Now, as we're going to see, that doesn't mean that he doesn't bear fruit, however. Okay? But he has begun in a very different place, and he's leading them to Jesus. Okay? Now Paul says, I have fixed your ignorance. I have informed you. You know now. So what should you do about it? You have a choice. You need to reconsider, because judgment is coming. And then he says, the assurance of this is that God has raised a man from the dead. This is the last misconception of the Epicureans and the Stoics Paul seeks to address, and this is where he loses his audience, or most of them. Okay? Because both the Epicureans and the Stoics were materialists. They believed there's no spirit. Everything is a body. It has material extension, in technical terms. And so, for the Epicureans, when you die, your soul dies, your soul atoms disperse, and you're gone. There's nothing else. There's no afterlife, there's no resurrection, there's no punishment. You're just gone. This life is all you get. For the Stoics, on the other hand, they believe that you're reabsorbed back into the universe. So, kind of in a technical sense, you still live because your stuff is still around, and the universe is eternal. It's never going anywhere. It's just stuck in an eternal cycle of destruction and rebirth and recreation. But you lose your individuality, and there's no resurrection still. There's no punishment. There's no reward. You're just absorbed back into the stuff of the universe. This is where they lose him. This is where Luke tells us, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer at him. This is where they said, okay, you're just crazy, Paul. This guy's off his rocker. But others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out. That's where Paul stopped. He didn't continue to argue with them. He said, okay, I've said my piece. This is as far as I've been able to bring you. I'm going to let you think about it. And he stopped. He didn't press on. He showed some restraint, and that's kind of interesting. There are a few who want to know more. And then in verse 34, some men joined him and believed, among whom we have two, Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. We don't know how many. Okay? This isn't the thousands of the day of Pentecost. We're not given a specific number. We're just told there's a few. And that was Paul's harvest in Athens, at least while he was there. Luke doesn't record for us what happened after Paul left Athens, because the very next verse, he leaves Athens and goes to Corinth, which is what we'll be talking about next week. He doesn't stick around. This was just a waypoint on his journey to somewhere else. But it does bear some fruit. He doesn't win them all, but he does win some, which is exactly what he tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 9. He has presented himself, he has adopted the structures of Greek debate and rhetoric. He's pulled from their literature, he's pulled from their religious beliefs to try and convince them of the truth of the gospel and its significance in their lives. Paul isn't Greek, he's Jewish. Paul isn't a pagan, he's a Christian. He doesn't think that what they're doing is right, but he thinks that what they're doing is enough for him to talk to them so that hopefully they can one day do the right thing. That's what Paul's about. When he tells us he became all things to all men so that by all means he might save some, this is what he means. He's not becoming exactly like them, but he's getting in their heads. He wants to know how they think. He wants to know how they see the world so that he can say, aha, you believe that God is the universe. Let me tell you why that's wrong and why that is such fantastic news for you. That's Paul's strategy. Now, he's a bit more tactful than that, but, you get the idea. So what do we learn from Paul? If there are three things for you to take away from Paul's example here in Athens this morning, these are the three that I'd like you to think about for the next week. Effective evangelism is going to require three things from us. One, it requires earnest engagement with people, not with projects, with people, where they are, not where we want them to be. Okay? If you are setting out to learn how to play the game of soccer, you don't begin with learning how to head the ball. You start with learning how to kick it, dribble it, pass it, shoot with your feet. Then you move on to more advanced things. We start with people where they are, not where we want them to be. The second thing, patient attention to the things that are worshipped in the place of the living God. This theme runs throughout the entire Bible. The Old Testament prophets and the Psalms are full of railing against idols, dead things, things that are not God. Everything that isn't God is created. Worshipping anything but God is idolatry, and it doesn't matter whether it's an idea or a concept or another person or a piece of stone or your bank account or your promotion or anything else. If it isn't God, it's idolatry, plain and simple. It doesn't have to be a statue. But if we don't understand what it is that people love, if we don't understand the objects of their worship, we're not going to be able to reach them, because we're always going to be talking about something that they either don't care about or something that they don't consider of first importance. And until you get down to that deepest, most fundamental level, the root of what generates their desires, the root of what they are searching for, you're always going to be falling short of the mark. Patient attention. Finally, the third thing that we can learn from Paul is the humility to acknowledge truth, goodness, and beauty wherever they are found. Remember, he compliments the Athenians for their religious attitudes. He says, this is good. It's misdirected, but you are starting out on the right path, and I'm going to help you follow that to its logical conclusion. All truth is God's truth. In some parts of the church, that's kind of, I've lost the word now. It's so commonplace as to be almost meaningless, but it's true. All truth is God's truth. All goodness is God's goodness. All beauty is a reflection of God's beauty. All of these things come from him. Okay? This is a different sermon, why this all hangs together, but it's the truth. Where we see those things, we need to acknowledge them as such. You can be partially right. This is why I have my students show their work. Okay? You might end up with the wrong answer, but if I can see your work, I can tell you how many steps you got through correctly, and then I can help show you where you went astray. Same thing when we're talking to people. Somebody who is devoted to their family, even though they worship their family name and honor, has a kernel of the truth. Somebody who believes that the universe is ordered and that it's intelligible and rational has a kernel of the truth, even if they believe ultimately that it was created by chance. Okay? These three things: earnest engagement, patient attention, and humility. These three things we learn from Paul here in Athens. Today, then, it's customary to extend an invitation for people to be baptized. If you want to be baptized, there's water back here. Nothing stands in your way. But rather than just an invitation this morning to be baptized and to put on Christ, what I want to say to you this morning is you have an invitation to engage in the Great Commission again. Jesus tells his disciples, as you are going, disciple the nations. And then he tells them, disciple the nations by baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and by teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. That's what Paul is doing here. He hasn't made it to baptism yet, but he is teaching them. He is discipling them. He is showing us his example for us to follow. And that is the invitation that we have. Jesus' invitation is, come follow me, not just down into his death and up again in his resurrection, but out on the road. And as Paul shows us in Athens, we can't do that just sitting in here. This is very important, that we get together, that we reorient ourselves after a week out amongst many who are not Christians, who are not believers, but we always have to go back out again. And so there's this constant rhythm, week by week. The Spirit breathes in and gathers us all, and then the Spirit breathes out into the world, and we go out as God's instruments. That's the invitation to you this morning. If you haven't put on Christ, come. We've got water. We'll give you a dunk. And then you're going out on the road with us, because that's how it goes. If there's anything that we can do for you, please come as we stand and sing.